The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. It's folded stiffly like it had something personal against me, stamped with the unmistakable seal of the homeowners association that had been circling my land like vultures for years. And before I even opened it, I already knew it wouldn't be good because nothing that ever came from the HOA office was. It was always a warning, a notice, a threat dressed up in polite language. But this time, when I slid the paper out and saw the number printed in bold near the bottom, my breath actually caught in my chest. $350? Zero in fines for ongoing violations on my own land. I had lived on quietly, maintained responsibly, and paid taxes on long before the HOA even existed. And yet here they were, claiming that my fence line was 6 inches off code, that a gravel access road I'd used for decades wasn't approved, that my storage shed built before half the neighborhood was even zonked was an eyesore. As I stood there in my kitchen rereading the letter over and over, I felt that familiar mix of anger and disbelief that only comes from being targeted by people who think authority equals ownership. Because to the HOA board, rules mattered more than reality and power mattered more than truth. I wasn't new to their harassment. Ever since the surrounding land had been carved up and developed into a polished, cookie-cutter neighborhood with identical mailboxes and matching fences, the HOA had treated my property like an inconvenient stain on their master plan vision. Even though my parcel was never part of their subdivision, never signed into their covenants, and never benefited from their roads, their landscaping, or their amenities. But that didn't stop them from sending letters, issuing courtesy notices, and once even sending a private security contractor to photograph my land from the road like I was running some kind of criminal operation instead of a quiet rural property with a small workshop and open pasture. And every time I pushed back, they'd retreat just enough to regroup. Waiting for a moment, they thought I was weak. This fine, though, was different. It wasn't a warning or a request. It was an attack, a deliberate attempt to bury me under a number so large it felt unreal. And as I sat down at the kitchen table with the letter spread in front of me, coffee going cold beside it, I realized they weren't just trying to enforce rules, they were trying to force me out, because the land I sat on was valuable. It's more valuable than any of the identical houses around it, and the HOA board knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. They wanted me gone so my land could be absorbed, developed, and controlled, and in their minds. A massive fine was leverage, something that would scare me into selling cheap or folding quietly. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that I had spent the better part of my adult life dealing with paperwork, contracts, and legal language. And something about that letter didn't just feel aggressive, it felt sloppy. I read the citations carefully, line by line, noticing how often they referenced HOA bylaws instead of county ordinances, how they assumed jurisdiction without proving it, and how they kept using the phrase "within association boundaries," without ever defining where those boundaries legally began. And that was when a memory surfaced. Something my father had once mentioned in passing years ago when he transferred the property to me. About an old development agreement. A strange clause in a decades-old land deal that had never been fully resolved. And at the time I'd brushed it off as trivia. But now, staring at a $350,000 threat, that memory suddenly felt like a thread worth pulling. The next morning, instead of calling the HOA in a panic like they'd probably expected, I drove straight to the county records office, a concrete building that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, where land histories lived quietly in metal drawers. I requested every document tied to my parcel and the surrounding subdivision. Watching the clerk raise an eyebrow when she saw how far back my request went, but she said nothing, just handed me a stack of files thick enough to make my arm ache. And I spent hours there, flipping through plats, easements, transfers, annexation attempts, and half-finished agreements from decades ago, slowly piecing together a story that the HOA had either forgotten or hoped no one would ever read closely again. What I found wasn't obvious at first. It was buried beneath routine filings and technical language. But there it was, a development expansion agreement from years back, signed when the neighborhood was first being planned, an agreement that allowed the developer temporary access across my land for construction in exchange for a deferred compensation clause, a clause that had never been triggered, never been settled, and never been released. And as I followed that thread forward through amendments and ownership changes, my pulse started to quicken. Because the language was clear in a way that legal documents rarely are. Failure to satisfy the deferred terms resulted in a reversion of certain property interests, and those interests were in T-small strips or access rights. They included entire parcels that now made up the heart of the HOA's neighborhood. I sat back in my chair, surrounded by decades of paper, as the realization slowly settled in that this wasn't just a mistake or a technicality. It was a foundational flaw, something that undermined the very authority the HOA thought it wielded, and the more I cross-checked the documents, the clearer it became that at some point, long before I ever received, that fine ownership had quietly shifted on paper. Without anyone updating their assumptions, and the HOA in all its confidence and arrogance had been issuing fines, enforcing rules, and governing land it didn't legally control, land that, according to the records sitting right in front of me, belonged to me. By the time I left the records office that evening, the sun was low, and my head was buzzing, not with fear anymore, but with something sharper, something steadier, because the $350,000 fine that had felt like a threat the day before now felt like a mistake they were going to regret. And as I drove home past the manicured lawns and identical houses of the neighborhood, I looked at them differently, not as an intimidating wall of conformity pressing in on my land, but as pieces on a board. Pieces whose true ownership had been misunderstood for far too long. And I knew then that the HOA thought they were about to crush me. But in reality, they had just handed me the reason and the paper trail to finally expose the truth they never expected anyone to uncover. I didn't sleep that night, not because of anxiety, but because my mind wouldn't slow down, replaying the language of those documents over and over. Each clause clicking into place like gears in a long-abandoned machine finally turning again. And by morning, I had spread copies of everything across my dining table, arranging them in chronological order, highlighting dates, signatures, and cross-references, because if I was going to move forward, I needed absolute certainty, not assumptions. And certainty only comes from proof. The HOA had lawyers, committees, and money. But what I had was something they didn't expect anyone to look for: history. And history doesn't bend just because someone is loud enough. The deeper I went, the uglier the story became, because it was clear that when the original developer went bankrupt years ago, the mess left behind wasn't properly cleaned up, and the neighborhood that rose afterward was built on a foundation of rushed paperwork and optimistic shortcuts. With the county approving plats based on representations that were never fully verified, and the HOA forming later under the assumption that ownership and authority were settled matters, when in reality, several key conditions had never been met, including the deferred compensation clause tied to my land, which wasn't just a footnote but a central pillar of the agreement. It was the price the developer agreed to pay for expansion rights. And since that price was never paid, the expansion itself was legally incomplete, meaning the parcels sold afterward existed in a kind of legal limbo, occupied, improved, taxed, but never truly transferred in the way the law required. I took the documents to a real estate attorney that afternoon, someone older, methodical, the kind of person who doesn't get excited easily. And I watched his expression shift slowly as he read, not dramatically, but in that subtle way professionals change when something crosses from routine into serious. And after nearly an hour of silence, broken only by the sound of paper turning, he finally looked up at me and said, "You're going to need patience," which is lawyer language for "this is big." And when I asked him directly whether I was imagining things, whether this could really mean what I thought it meant, he didn't answer immediately. Instead, pointing to specific clauses and explaining how, under state law, reversionary interests aren't symbolic, they're enforceably, and if the conditions triggering reversion were satisfied, then ownership didn't require anyone's permission to return. It simply did, whether people noticed or not. What made it worse or better, depending on perspective, is that the HOA's authority was entirely dependent on the legitimacy of those transfers. Because their bylaws, their covenants, their very existence rested on the assumption that the land they governed had been lawfully incorporated into the subdivision. And if that assumption failed, so did everything built on top of it, including the fines, the rules, and the threats they'd been hurling at me. And suddenly, the $350,000 fine felt less like an act of intimidation and more like a confession of ignorance. Because they were enforcing power they never had against someone who unknowingly held the deed to their entire stage, my attorney warned me not to rush, not to march into the HOA office waving documents like a victory flag, because when people feel their authority slipping, they don't respond rationally, and instead, we began the slow, careful process of verification, ordering certified copies, checking tax records, confirming that no later amendments had quietly resolved the issue. And every time we checked, the answer came back the same and finished. Unresolved, reverted, and as the picture sharpened, another realization hit me. One that sat heavier than triumph. Dozens of families were living in homes they believed they owned outright, paying mortgages, HOA dues, and property taxes, completely unaware that the legal ground beneath them was compromised. And while none of that was their fault, it also didn't change the truth of the situation. The HOA, however, wasn't slowing down. Unaware of what I had uncovered, they escalated their pressure, sending follow-up notices, adding penalties, threatening liens, and each letter felt almost surreal now, like watching someone double down on a bluff without realizing the cards had already been laid face up on the table. And when they finally sent a notice of intent to place a lien on my property to enforce the fine, my attorney smiled thinly and said, "Good, because that move crossed a line that forced the issue into the open." Legally and publicly, where their assumptions would finally be tested, we responded not with an argument, but with a request of formal demand for proof of jurisdiction, ownership authority, and standing to issue fines on my parcel, attaching excerpts of the very documents they had either ignored or never known existed. And the silence that followed was immediate and telling. Weeks passed without a reply, then months, during which the HOA's board meetings grew increasingly tense, according to neighbors who quietly began reaching out to me curious, worried, sensing that something wasn't right, and though I said little, the rumor mill did, the rest spreading whispers that the HOA was looking into something, that lawyers were involved, that documents were being reviewed, and the polished confidence that once defined the board began to crack. Eventually, the response came, not as an apology or a withdrawal, but as a vague assertion that their legal counsel disagreed with our interpretation. Without addressing the specific clauses or providing counter-documentation, which told me everything I needed to know, because disagreement without evidence is just denial wearing a suit. And when we pressed further, requesting their proof of settlement for the deferred compensation clause, they couldn't produce it, because it didn't exist. And at that moment, the balance of power shifted completely, even if they didn't want to admit it yet. The real turning point came when the county assessor's office, alerted to the dispute, initiated its own review, because tax records don't care about politics or pride, only accuracy. And once they began cross-referencing ownership histories, the discrepancies surfaced in their system too, triggering a chain reaction of internal audits, notices, and questions that the HOA couldn't silence or spin. And suddenly this wasn't just a fight between me and a board of overreaching volunteers. It was a matter of public record, one that threatened to expose years of assumptions, approvals, and collections built on an incomplete transfer of land rights. Driving through the neighborhood now felt different in a deeper way. It wasn't just that I knew something they didn't, it was that the landscape itself seemed to carry a hidden layer of meaning. Every street, every sidewalk, every carefully planted tree sitting on land whose legal story had been interrupted and forgotten. And while I didn't feel joy at that knowledge, I felt responsibility, because whatever happened next would affect real people, not just an HOA that had overstepped its bounds. And as the county review moved forward and the HOA's silence grew louder, it became clear that the fine they had issued to intimidate me had instead opened a door they could never close again, one that led straight to the question they had never imagined anyone asking: who actually owns this neighborhood? The moment the county's review became official, the atmosphere around the neighborhood changed in a way that was impossible to ignore, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon that everyone could sense but no one wanted to name. And while the HOA board tried to project calm through carefully worded emails and tightly controlled meeting agendas, the cracks were everywhere, showing up in hurried conversations at the mailbox, whispered questions at the park, and the sudden nervous politeness of board members who had once spoken to me only through threats and certified letters. Because authority is easy to perform when it's unquestioned, but once doubt enters the room, it drains confidence faster than anger ever could. The HOA's first real response wasn't legal, it was political. They began circulating talking points, insisting the situation was a minor title discrepancy, something technical that would be resolved quickly, and urging residents not to panic, not to stop paying dues, and not to contact the county directly, which only had the opposite effect, because telling people not to ask questions is the fastest way to make them start. And soon, my phone was ringing more than it ever had, with homeowners reaching out cautiously at first, then more urgently, wanting to know what I knew, what the documents said, and whether their homes were really at risk. And while I was careful not to inflame the situation, I didn't lie either, because lies were what had created this mess in the first place. As the pressure mounted, the HOA's legal counsel finally stepped forward, filing a motion to affirm their authority and enforce the lien they'd threatened. And that was the moment the conflict crossed fully into the public legal arena, because in doing so, they forced a judge to look directly at the ownership chain, something no one had done in years. And when our response hit the docket complete with certified records, expert opinions, and a clear timeline showing exactly where the transfer failed, the tone of the case shifted from routine enforcement to something much larger, something structural, and you could feel it in the courtroom the first time we appeared. The way the judge leaned forward instead of back, the way questions became sharper, more precise, less patient with vague answers. The HOA's attorneys argued intent, claiming that everyone had always believed the neighborhood belonged to the association, that homes had been sold, taxes paid, and services provided under that belief. But belief doesn't transfer property, and as our attorney calmly explained, property law doesn't run on assumptions or good intentions. It runs on completed acts and satisfied conditions, and when those conditions fail, the consequences don't disappear just because time has passed. And the judge seemed to understand that, immediately pressing the HOA on where the deferred compensation was documented, where the release was recorded, where the proof existed that the reversion had been nullified, and each time the answer circled back to the same uncomfortable truth: they didn't have it. Outside the courtroom, panic finally set in. Board members resigned quietly, one after another. Citing personal reasons, vendors paused contracts, unsure who they were actually working for. And residents demanded emergency meetings that devolved into shouting matches as people realized how exposed they were. Because if the HOA didn't legally control the land, what did that mean for their dues, their rules, their insurance, their loans, and the very idea of ownership they'd built their lives around? And while some directed their fear at me, accusing me of stirring trouble, others began to understand that I wasn't the cause, just the mirror reflecting a truth that had been ignored for too long. The strangest part was how quickly the power dynamic flipped. The same board that had once fined me without hesitation now requested meetings, spoke in careful language, and floated the idea of amicable resolution, suggesting settlements, boundary adjustments, and retroactive agreements that would conveniently legitimize their authority going forward. But every proposal shared the same flaw: they all assumed I needed them, when in reality, the opposite was becoming clear. Because as the legal process continued, the county's findings aligned with ours, confirming that the reversionary interest had indeed triggered, and that, on paper, ownership of the subdivision parcels had reverted back to my family's original holding entity before being transferred to me. A fact that sent shockwaves through every layer of the neighborhood's governance. I never set out to control a neighborhood. All I wanted was to be left alone on my land, but intent stopped mattering once reality took over. And now I found myself in a position where every decision I made, or didn't make, would shape the outcome for hundreds of people. And that weight sat heavy on me, especially when I started receiving letters not from the HOA, but from lenders, title companies, and insurers, all seeking clarification, all suddenly aware that something fundamental had gone wrong. And each inquiry reinforced the same conclusion. The HOA's authority was collapsing not because of a technical loophole, but because it had never been properly built in the first place. As weeks turned into months, the court issued interim orders freezing HOA enforcement actions, halting fines, and suspending lien activity, effectively stripping the board of the tools it had used to intimidate and control. And the silence that followed was deafening, because without enforcement, without fines, without threats, the HOA was just a name, a shell of meetings and emails without teeth. And residents began organizing independently, discussing alternatives, exploring the idea of dissolving the association entirely, while others quietly asked what it would mean if I, the person they'd never voted for and rarely spoken to, was now the legal owner of the land beneath their homes. I didn't rush to answer that question because the final ruling hadn't come yet. But the direction was clear, and everyone could feel it, including the HOA's remaining leadership, who finally understood that their attempt to crush me with a $350,000 fine had backfired, spectacularly exposing not just an overreach but a fundamental misunderstanding of ownership. And as the judge scheduled the final hearing, the neighborhood held its breath, knowing that whatever happened next would rewrite the rules they'd lived under for years, and possibly redefine who truly held the power over the place they all called home. The final hearing arrived not with drama, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, the sort that settles in when everyone involved already knows the answer and is just waiting for it to be spoken aloud. And as I sat in the courtroom listening to the last arguments, it was clear that the HOA's case had unraveled beyond repair because they were no longer defending authority so much as pleading for mercy, asking the court to preserve the status quo in the name of stability, fairness, and community harmony. But the law isn't designed to protect comfort built on mistakes. And when the judge delivered the ruling, it was precise, unemotional, and absolute. The deferred compensation clause had never been satisfied. The reversionary interest had triggered as written, and as a result, legal ownership of the subdivision parcels rested with me, not the HOA, meaning the association had no standing to issue fines, enforce rules, or claim governance over the neighborhood, rendering the $350,000 fine not just invalid, but emblematic of a broader overreach that the court could no longer ignore. The fallout was immediate and profound. The HOA was effectively dissolved overnight, its accounts frozen pending audit, its contracts voided, and its board stripped of authority. And while the ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, it also brought an unexpected sense of clarity, because for the first time in years, the uncertainty that had been simmering beneath the surface was out in the open. Residents, though shaken, were no longer being misled by a structure that had claimed power without legal grounding. And as the reality set in that I now technically owned the land beneath their homes, I felt none of the triumph people might imagine, only the weight of responsibility that comes with holding leverage over others' lives. I addressed the neighborhood not as an adversary, but as a neighbor, holding a community meeting in the same clubhouse where the HOA once issued citations and fines. And I told them the truth plainly, that I had no intention of evicting anyone, no desire to exploit a mistake for personal gain, and no interest in ruling their lives through a different set of arbitrary rules. Because the point had never been power, it had been fairness and boundaries. And I explained the path forward, working with the county to regularize titles, offering fair, transparent terms for transferring ownership back to homeowners, dissolving the old structure and replacing it with voluntary agreements where people actually consented to the rules they lived under. And the tension in the room eased, not because fear vanished, but because honesty finally replaced intimidation. Some residents were angry, others grateful, many simply exhausted, but over time cooperation replaced conflict, because people realized that the nightmare they'd feared wasn't being owned by one individual. It was being controlled by an entity that answered to no one. And in contrast, accountability suddenly mattered. And as months passed, deeds were corrected, titles clarified. And the neighborhood redefined itself not as an HOA-dominated enclave, but as a collection of homeowners who actually understood what they owned and why. And in the end, the irony was in T, lost on anyone the HOA that fined me $350,000 for violations on my land had been standing on ground it never truly controlled. And by trying to crush me, they had exposed the very flaw that ended their reign. Looking back, the lesson wasn't about revenge or victory, but about the danger of unchecked authority and the quiet power of knowing your rights. Because ownership isn't just a line on a map or a clause in a bylaw, it's a responsibility grounded in law, history, and truth. And when those things are ignored, even the most confident institutions can collapse under their own assumptions. And so the neighborhood moved forward, not perfectly, not without scars, but free from the illusion that power can be declared into existence, knowing now that real authority has to be earned, documented, and respected, or it will eventually be reclaimed by the truth it tried to bury.